Okay, I'd say we can go ahead and get started. I want to thank you all for joining us. We at Signet really love to do this one, and it's a really good way to figure out if you should take or your student should take the ACT or the SAT. I know we have some students here, some parents. So Sheila, who is our COO and a co-owner of Signet, one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. She is going to go through this presentation, tell you the differences between the SAT, the ACT, and how you or your student can prep during a pandemic, since we are still in this pandemic, but we'll be out soon. So thank you so much for joining us. There will be a recording of this, so if you want to share this with your friends or your family, you will receive an email in a few days after this is over with the recording. So, want to go ahead, Sheila?
Great. Savannah, can you tell us how we should handle questions?
Yes, absolutely. So at the very end, we will have a Q&A session. So if you want to go ahead and chat as a question pops up, we will answer them at the end, or Sheila will. And if there's anything basic about Signet, like our phone number or anything like that, I can answer during the session itself. But we will go ahead and do Q&A at the very end. So put your questions in as they come up.
Okay, great. It's good for me to know too, because then I won't stop myself if I see a chat pop up, but I hope you guys all populate the chat with all your questions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then I'm going to put this in presentation mode. Can you all see?
Yes, looks great.
I'm going to try to keep all of your lovely faces up at the top, so it doesn't look like I'm looking down in the corner when I'm actually looking at you. Great. All right, so as Savannah said, thank you for joining us. I always love doing this webinar. I feel like it's one of those rare times where I can deliver some, very basic information, but have a huge impact. So I really enjoy hosting it. I'm Sheila, as Savannah so nicely introduced me. I've been with Signet since 2010. I am the president and COO. I have a varied educational background. I've been doing test prep myself since 2004, and have had my hands in developing our curricula and training all of our people. And so I know, how we do things very, very well. I'm also the client liaison at Signet, because I know Signet so well. So if any of you call for services, I'm the one you're going to get to talk to, and we'll talk in detail about your specific situation. All right, so let's get started here. I want to start with some basics, and apologies if you guys know some of the answers here, but we'll start from the ground up, and then we'll get into some more specifics. So we're talking about the SAT and the ACT today. Now, my experience of talking to our clients is most people are kind of focused on one or the other, and they don't realize that they have the option of taking either one. And there is some value in spending some time thinking about which one to take, because every college does accept them the same, though every student may react to them differently. Some students are more naturally successful at one rather than the other. So I want to talk a little bit about what the differences are in the tests. And I'll reemphasize that colleges don't care which one you take. And then we'll talk about how the scores are used in the admissions process, because after all, that's the whole point of jumping through this hoop. It's not to get a good score on the test. It's to hopefully open some doors for you to the colleges where you can be the most successful and learn the things that you need to learn to have a successful life and career. So we'll start with these initial questions. So here is a rough outline of the structure of the two tests. So I'm going to move a little bit quickly, but of course we can come back to this if you have questions. We'll start with the SAT. That is scored out of 1,600. There are actually 4 sections on the SAT, but the score you'll get is broken down into 2. They actually combine the reading, writing, and language sections, and then the 2 math sections. So often when people talk about the SAT, they talk about a verbal score and a math score. That's what we're talking about. Actually, I didn't have a chance to update this part of the presentation. The College Board, the company that makes the SAT, just axed the optional essay. It is no longer optional. It is not even an option anymore. You can't take it even if you wanted to. So that will no longer be a possibility for you, but there will be these 4 other sections. A total of 3 hours and 50 minutes. That's without the essay. So it's a pretty long test. To give you some context, you know, a lot of people think in terms of the Ivy League. So a good Ivy League SAT score is anything above 1450. You know, some people say the higher the better. I tend to say once you hit, you know, close to 1500, stop testing. It's not going to make a difference whether you have a 1520 or a 1500. But some people, you know, want to get a certain score out of, you know, some sort of personal goal. That's fine. But that should give you some context of what, you know, the top scorers in the nation or in the world are really getting. The national average is right around 1000 though. The ACT is a different test made by a different company. It is scored out of 36. And there are also 4 sections, and they still have an optional essay. There's an English section, which is very similar to the writing and language section of the SAT. There's a math section, there's a reading section, and then there's what they call a science section, but it doesn't test a student's knowledge of science. It's really their facility with scientific texts. So it's sort of like a technical reading section. And then there is an optional essay. Without the essay, it's 3 hours and 35 minutes. So you can already see that with 4 sections, it's already less time than the SAT's 4 sections. And that's one of the most salient differences between these 2 tests. They test the same material, but they test it in different ways. And in particular, the ACT is a little bit more straightforward in terms of the questions, but you have less time per question. And the SAT, the questions are a little bit tricky. Some people describe them as puzzles or brain teasers. So they're a little less straightforward, and therefore you get a little more time per question. So that can be one of the deciding factors. If your student is quite a fast reader, can be accurate while working very quickly, the ACT might be a better test for them. There are still other trade-offs though, and we can talk about that as we kind of move forward here. So, as I said before, the colleges don't care which test you take. There is an official concordance between the SAT and the ACT so that they can translate between these 2 different types of tests. For a long time, the SAT was a more popular test. Colleges still didn't care which one you took, but more people took the SAT. That has been different. Actually, since 2015, the ACT has been the more popular test across the world and in the United States. And part of that is because the SAT has actually redesigned itself several times, whereas the ACT hasn't. So there's a little bit more kind of stability in the structure of the ACT. And I think that leads a lot of people to focus on that test instead. So before we talk a little bit more in detail about how to choose between the 2 tests, let's talk about the application process. Signet has a whole team of former admissions officers, and that's where my knowledge of this comes from. And these are the top factors in holistic admission. So holistic admissions means it's not automatic admission based on a grade point average or a test score. They like to consider all sorts of factors about a student in order to identify whether that student is a good fit for their college. I apologize, there seems to be a helicopter going by. I hope that's not too distracting. And fit is really key, right? The student should fit academically, socially, culturally into the school that they're looking at. And that's kind of one of the things that, one of the lenses that colleges use in order to determine whether a student should be accepted or not is are they a fit? But also what they're looking for, particularly with the top 3 factors here, the grades, the rigors of courses, and the test scores, they're looking to see whether they can predict if the student will be academically successful on their campus, right? Can they handle the workload, the rigor of the classes in that particular college? And they use these things as proxies to try to judge that. Now, over the years, a lot of colleges have dropped testing requirements. This year with COVID, almost every college has dropped testing requirements or made them optional because there just wasn't access to testing. And we'll talk about a little more about how COVID is impacting this whole process. But even before COVID, there were 12 or 1,300 colleges in the United States that were test optional or test blind, meaning you don't have to submit a test score to be considered for admission, or even if you submit a test score, they're not going to look at it if they're test blind. And that's because there is a very high correlation of test scores and socioeconomic status. And they found that grades alone were a very good predictor of success in college. And adding in test scores as another data point in trying to make that prediction didn't actually make the prediction much, much better. It made it a little bit better, but not so much that it's worth making students go through the testing process and everything that's involved with it, especially since it's very clear that the tests can be biased. So my prediction is that we'll see more and more colleges go test optional. It remains to be seen what colleges are going to do for this next admission cycle for students who are applying in the fall of 2021 to start college in the fall of 2022. I think it really depends on what's happening with COVID in this country. But as I said, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So these top factors are things that colleges, many different types of colleges, not only the top, most selective colleges, but middle of the road colleges and less selective colleges as well, mark as their most important factors in the process. The National Association of College Admissions Counselors does a huge survey every year to see how admissions offices use these various pieces of the application. And for as long as I can remember, grades, rigor of courses, test scores, and personal essay have been the top 4 factors. So that's really where you should be focusing if you're thinking about, the bigger picture in college. GPA is far more important than a test score. A lot of people do say that if your GPA is a little bit low, maybe you can kind of compensate that with a high test score. And that is true to some extent, but that also sends a message that your student, for whatever reason, has not been able to apply themselves in school, but they took a test very seriously. That may raise questions about, executive function challenges or attitude problems or who knows what, right? So I would say, focus your energy on keeping a student's grades up. Test scores are very important, but they are not the make or break factor in many cases. They are one component of many. Extracurriculars, teacher recommendations, activities, other types of tests. The IB scores, the AP scores. I had SAT subject tests on here, but that was also just canceled in the same way that the SAT essay was canceled on Tuesday. So those are no longer an option, not something anyone has to worry about anymore, which I think is a great thing. Colleges do give preference for students with legacy status, meaning a close relative has also gone to that institution. The interview can play a role depending on the type of school that you're applying to, and then whether the student is asking for financial aid or not can also impact the student's admissibility depending on the type of school. So lots of things to consider far beyond test scores. And of course, if you have any questions about this, let me know. I'm always happy to talk. But now that we have sort of the context, the constellation in which test scores play their role, let's talk a little bit more about how to prep. So the first thing you want to do is pick a test. Like I said, we've got our 2 choices, ACT or SAT. Once you've understood which test is better for the student, you want to define a goal score. What are we aiming for? And that could be based, we'll go into detail of this, but that could be based on the colleges that you're thinking about. That could be based on how long you have before a test date, or it could be based on an aspiration, pure aspiration. Then you'll want to pick some test dates. I recommend registering for 2 at a time because most students do take these tests twice. And then you want to make a study plan and stick to it. The stick to it part is the really hard part. And that's where a tutor can help. But let's go through this in a little more detail. So first thing is you want to choose which test to take. We've got 2 paths here, the SAT or the ACT. It is very rare that a student takes both tests. We really recommend picking one and just putting all of your attention towards that. The 2 tests are about 70%, I would say, similar in terms of content and format. But that last 30% can make all the difference. As I said, there are timing differences. There are sort of trickiness levels that are different. The SAT, for example, also has more sophisticated reading passages than the ACT does. So that's also something to consider. Really, the best way to figure out which test your student is going to do better on is to take 2 official practice tests in realistic conditions, meaning quiet area, no distractions, and under time constraints. Official practice tests are widely available on the SAT website or on the ACT website. You can also contact me. I can send you some. We also do free practice testing over Zoom, where you can do this with us, and we'll give you our thoughts on this. But once your student has taken these tests, you don't want to take them back to back, give a few days between them. But once your student's taken these tests, you can compare the results and your student's experience of the test, right? So quantitative and qualitative factors are important. Quantitative being, what was the score on the SAT? What was the score on the ACT? Use the official concordance to compare and see which one they did better on. But also ask the student, where did you feel rushed? How easy was it for you to know what you needed to do to be successful on this question? Which one just felt easier to you? Which one did you feel more relaxed on? Which one made you nervous? All of those factors can be very important. A lot of the time, students' results will actually be pretty similar between the 2 tests, but they will have a strong qualitative preference for one or the other. And my recommendation is not to fight an uphill battle. Go with the one that they feel they can do better on, because you'll have an easier time getting them to prep for that. And then in cases where it's really difficult to tell, like qualitatively and quantitatively, that's where you can call someone like me and I can help you figure out which is going to be better. There may also be things happening logistically that could help you decide. So the 2 tests are given several times a year. We'll look at the test dates in a second, and they're not given on the same dates. And sometimes that just matches up better with the student's schedule. So that could be the deciding factor as well. And again, really just focus on one, not both. There are rare cases where I recommend a student doing both, but they are so rare that it's highly unlikely it applies to you. So try to choose one. All right. Now, the next piece is to set a goal score, and this could be an initial goal score. And then once you achieve it, you can move that goalpost if you want to. But I do recommend you try to be as realistic as possible. It is rare that students improve more than, let's say, 300 or 400 points on the SAT or 6 or 7 points on the ACT. It happens, but it takes a lot of work. Right. Our averages at Signet, for example, range between 200 and 300 points on the SAT overall, and 2 to 5 points on the ACT overall. Right. And that's working with, some of the industry's best tutors. So think about what that means if you're going to do it on your own. But other factors to consider include college goals. So I have this really great chart here. I have one for the ACT as well, that gives you a sense of, based on how competitive or how selective a school is, the kinds of scores that they are looking for and the kinds of GPAs that they are looking for, right? We actually have a really nice file about this that we could send around with the follow-up that will give you the names of the schools in each of these categories and the ACT and SAT charts versus GPA. It can be a very helpful tool. The diagnostic starting point, as I said, where you're starting, you can only expect so much improvement over that. Your initial practice test score by no means is predicting where you'll end up. You'll certainly improve just from having done one practice. But again, you want to be realistic in the improvements you can make over where you're starting, given the amount of time you have. Your students' motivation is a huge factor. If you are dragging them kicking and screaming into this process, it's going to be like pulling teeth to get some increases. They've really got to find some internal motivation to go through this. I really do feel like this test is not a measure of a student's intelligence or potential, but unfortunately it is a hoop that colleges are making students jump through. So if the college is important to the student, they're going to have to find some way to motivate themselves through the process. And then of course, time, both in terms of how far out is your test date. So how many weeks do you have to study and practice? And how much time does a student have in their schedule, right? A lot of students are really, really busy. I know COVID has changed that, but a lot of students are really, really busy with extracurriculars or family commitments or maybe a part-time job. So how much time realistically do they have in a week to put into their practice? And all of those factors can change what your goal score might be. All right, so here's the test dates. Once you've got kind of a goal score in mind, you can choose a test date. Now, as I said, the tests are given several times throughout the year. These are the dates that we know. And the dates for the fall, meaning September or later for the ACT or August for later for the SAT, will be released usually by March or April. Last year, because of COVID, both testing agencies added several dates. Many tests were canceled, so students kept getting bumped into later and later test dates. So they ended up having extra administrations in September, October, and November for both of these tests. Remains to be seen if they're going to add any dates for the spring. As far as I know, dates are still getting canceled, but not everywhere. So the February and March tests, not really sure if they're going to go through everywhere, though we do have a little more confidence that the June and beyond tests will go forward. All right, once you have a goal score and a test date, we need a good prep plan. And I really encourage you to make something quite detailed, right? There are several phases, right? You need to learn and understand your material, practice it in the context of the test, and then really master the test. So continued practice, continued tweaking of the content knowledge and the strategies. And some questions that can help you build a good study plan include setting dates for what sections are covered. And by when are you going to have, all of the math topics reviewed or all of the grammar rules reviewed? How often are you going to do practice tests, and what specific dates? Block them out, because you need a 4-hour block to do it. So block them out ahead of time so you know when you're going to be doing these, and gather your material so everything is ready. I usually recommend a practice test every 4 to 5 weeks, and then more often as you're actually approaching your test date. And how much time per week will you actually devote for testing? And this will vary by student. When students work with our tutors, they're usually meeting with a tutor for about an hour and a half a week, and then doing another hour and a half to 2 hours of practice work on their own. So all told, 3.5 hours a week. It doesn't have to be all at once. In fact, some of the best practice happens incrementally, half an hour a day, 15 minutes here and there. But sometimes you do need to practice an entire timed section. So you might need an hour at a time, or if you want to do a full practice test, that would be at least 4 hours. So setting aside that time is really important as part of this plan. Knowing the thresholds where you will ask for help is also really important, because students can definitely do a lot of this on their own. The reason a lot of people go to a tutor or a course is because sometimes it's easier to go to somebody who's been experienced for years and years and can tell them immediately, you need to change this thing. Your student probably figure that out on their own after hours of knocking their head against the wall, but save a lot of stress and time by having a tutor help you understand what you can do more immediately. At the same time, students can do a lot on their own, reviewing old concepts, doing practice problems and things like that. But there's got to be a threshold at which they ask for help, either from an older sibling, someone else they know who's taken this test and done well, a teacher, or a tutor. So what are those thresholds? So your student knows when they need to turn outside of their normal resources. And how will they know if they're ready to test? I always say, once you've hit your goal score 3 or 4 times on a practice test under realistic conditions, then you're ready for the real test. And I usually ask my students to wait until we've gotten that kind of consistency before they take a real test. They may be registered, but we may be changing their registration dates. So that's my personal approach. A lot of people will say, well, we're just going to do the first one and see what happens. And then between the first and the second is where they kick up that prep a notch and really, really practice towards that goal score. Because once you hit the second or third test, there's sort of diminishing returns. We don't see a lot of increases after that, but it is very common to see increases between the first and second, and then the second and third. And then for students who have accommodations, either extra time or a reader or a large format test, how are you going to practice those specific accommodations? We see this a lot, students not knowing what to do with all that extra time, not knowing how to use it effectively. And so that can be very, very important for students with accommodations. So these are just some basic questions to cover when you're creating a plan for your test. And of course, if you do practice tests with us, what we'll do is we'll sit down and go through all of this. I'll be able to work with you to develop a goal score, figure out the right test dates, and then look in detail about which topics the student needs to practice, how I recommend they do that, the timeline for doing all of that. And then of course, if you work with the tutor, we turn that into a whole study plan for your student. But I want to just give you a plug for the diagnostics, because that's, I think, really one of the most valuable things we do, and we do it for free, and I really love doing it. So please call us for free practice tests, and we'll take you through that whole process. So that's how you prep for the test normally. But for the past year almost now, we have not been in normal times. And so I want to address COVID a little bit. COVID-19 has had huge impacts on testing and on college admissions. So first and foremost, there have been test cancellations. So right around when all of the quarantines started happening, or the stay-at-home orders started happening in the US in mid-March, there was an SAT. And the SAT, the College Board, the company that writes the SAT, was not great about communicating around cancellations. There were plenty of students who showed up to the test to find a note taped to the door that their test was canceled. And unfortunately, that is still happening. There are some test sites that cancel 2 weeks in advance or a month in advance. So students have plenty of time to kind of wrap their head around the fact they're not taking the test, change their prep routine, reschedule for another date, whatever they need to do. And there are still plenty of centers that it's just happening day of, that there's a note on the door, or the door is locked. There's not even a note. And then, families are scrambling to try to reschedule and figure out how they're getting a refund or what they're doing. So I just encourage you to be really aware that this could still be happening into the fall next year, depending on what happens with the vaccine and the virus numbers. Both the ACT and the SAT have talked about offering some sort of digital test. That's what I mean by the remote test that's on here. But neither of them have announced launch dates for this. So we remain hopeful that that will be a solution, but unclear when that would be rolled out. The other big change is that college testing policies have changed a lot. So like I said, this year, almost every college went test optional. There were a few colleges that didn't. In Florida, and I think a few of the military academies still required tests. But the vast majority of colleges went test optional or took this opportunity to go test blind. Some colleges just made the policy change for last year, meaning this year's seniors who are applying last fall to go to college in fall of 2021. And some of them took the opportunity to say, we're going to do this for 3 years. And some of them took the opportunity to go permanently test optional. So the dust is sort of still settling on this. I don't think we will know what is going to happen for next fall's application cycle until the application cycle for this fall is actually over, which is not going to be till May, when this year's seniors actually commit to the various schools that they've been accepted to. And at that point, colleges will be able to look at who is coming and how does that class compare to other classes. And then again, I think we'll be flying by the seat of our pants a little bit into the fall, depending on what's happening with the virus. I imagine that if students can't test this spring or summer at all, many colleges will stay test optional into the fall. So this puts any of you who have a junior this year into a very difficult situation. Do you prep and maybe waste the time and money to prep for one of these tests because it may not be required in the end? Or do you not prep and then find out that you do need a test to go to the college of your dreams and then have to scramble to do it? So my recommendation is if it's within your means, I would say spend the time prepping. And again, you don't have to do it with a tutor. You could do it on your own. But spend the time prepping, investing is sort of in an insurance policy in case the tests are needed. At least you will have, you won't be starting from scratch when you realize that. And the other challenge here is that the testing centers have limited capacity. So a lot of students this fall were signed up for a test and then they got bumped from their center because in order to meet social distancing protocols, they had to essentially have the number of students they could have in the building or in the testing room. So a lot of students got bumped to other dates. And so what's happening now, as those spring dates are still open for registration, the spots are going so quickly. People are really worried that they're going to get bumped again, or it's going to get canceled. So people are registering for multiple tests at a time, and the centers are filling up quite a bit. The ACT and the SAT are aware of this, and they have tried to increase capacity in various ways. I know the ACT was renting out, conference rooms in hotels. They're both talking to colleges about opening, rooms on campus for testing and things like that. But it is a logistical struggle because even college campuses and hotels still have to follow, the safety protocols, and many of them have limited staff as well. So it's a big challenge, and I wish I could tell you exactly what's going to happen, but it's very uncertain right now. So how do you prep during a pandemic? What changes? I would say all the solutions are remote. It's very unlikely that you're going to find a place that will do in-person prep. So you got to find a remote solution that is really going to work for your student. And all of these things existed before the pandemic and will exist long after the pandemic is gone. But you could buy a prep book, and most of those come with access to some sort of digital platform for practice tests and things like that. There are places with pre-recorded video lessons, some of which are free. Khan Academy is a great example of that. There are adaptive practice programs where you can take a practice test and then a computer algorithm will tell you, what you need to practice and what you need to study, and feed your student practice problems. There's not a lot of instruction included in those sorts of platforms, but they can be really great for practice. And then there's, live group or one-on-one lessons. These are all happening virtually. Like I said, you really want to make sure they're happening on a learning focused platform. So I know a lot of schools are using Zoom for instruction. We'll use Zoom for some things, for webinars and initial calls and things like that. But we really like to use a platform that is meant for educating. So we use things with a shared whiteboard, with the ability to upload problems, ability to record or download the materials that have been uploaded, so a student can review those things afterward. The software that we use is called Lesson Space, and it also integrates math tools. Like you can have a graph paper background. You can write math equations easily. Students and tutors can both write on the screen very easily. It works on a tablet. And there are a lot of other types of solutions to this, maybe a document camera or other types of programs. But I encourage you, as you are evaluating what kind of prep your student is going to do, to think about that. What does this actually look like in practice? And are they just staring at a screen more? Are they expected to have disciplined instructor on their own? Or is there some solution for accountability, which is another big challenge that students are facing with remote learning? You don't have the structure of school or the FaceTime with teachers, or even seeing people in the hallway that could keep them on track. With test prep, it's sort of the same thing. It's more of a solitary pursuit, but you still need accountability. So does that mean they're filing some sort of report to you with what they've done? Are they reporting their results to you? Are they taking tests often to see their improvements? And if they're not making improvements, what's happening then? So I think accountability is really the key to all of this. And that's one of the reasons people turn to a one-on-one tutor. The relationship that a student has with the tutor can help build a lot of that accountability. All right, so just a little plug for Signet here. I won't spend too much time on it. You've already heard that if you work with Signet, you'll get a personalized plan. We have incredible tutors who are real experts at these tests from beginning to end, meaning understanding which test to take, setting a goal score, working through all of the phases of a prep plan, and then really getting them ready for test day, and then looking at the scores and saying, okay, do we need to take this again, or what else do we need to focus on? We also have a team approach. I'm involved with every single case. My tutors talk to each other, they support each other. And, you know, we've worked with so many students that it's very rare that we haven't seen a situation before, or that someone on our team hasn't seen a situation before, and we're very collaborative. And our goal is really the shortest distance from A to Z. We want students to spend as little time on prep as they can, so that they have more time for the things that actually matter in their lives. And hopefully this will take a lot of stress off of parents and students, and we can really get back to the things that, that matter. All right, now question and answer. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if anyone needs to go back to a slide for their question, we can do that. But let's just go to questions.
Feel free to come off mute, or you can put your questions in the chat and I can read them off for you. Any questions you might have, we'd love to answer.
I assume that the two things in the chat were questions. They were just from you.
They were from me, yes. Telling everyone about the Q&A and also any the recording that will be sent out.
Great, great.
Hi, this is Deborah. Can you hear me?
Hi, Deborah. Yes.
Yeah. So my question is, you might have mentioned about that, but so what is a good ACT score? And,
Oh, you know, I didn't mention it. Good catch. Good catch. I told you that a good SAT score is 1450, and I want to put air quotes around good, right? I'm talking about top tier colleges. They're looking for 1450 or above on the SAT and 33 or above on the ACT, right? Good can be different for different types of students depending on the schools that they're targeting.
and then my second question is, when is a good time to start preparing for ACT or SAT?
Yeah, we usually recommend that after sophomore year is done, you start the process of deciding which test is the right test. And then at least, you know, you may not prep the summer after sophomore year, but at least you have a plan in place so you know when to start prep. Most juniors do take the test in May or June for the first time of their junior year. I like to see juniors trying to take it in the winter of their junior year. It gives them more of a chance to, if they need to take it multiple times, they can do that. And it takes a little bit of the stress off, because the summer after junior year is really when you're going to be working on your college list and starting to work on your essays. So if we can give the student a little space between getting the test score solidified and then starting that list development process, it's usually quite helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, we have a question. How accurate to predict the real score from the practice test from College Board?
Yeah, so I like to say we're pretty accurate. I don't think I can give you a percentage of accuracy, but when I look at a student's diagnostic test, their initial diagnostic test, I can usually tell within a few, 10 or 20 points on the SAT or 1 point, 2 points on the ACT, where they're going to end up if they, commit to really prepping, 2 to 3 hours a week for X number of weeks, depending on the goal score. I have seen students do better and do worse than I have predicted. But that practice score just means if you were to take the test today, this is probably what you would get. It doesn't mean if with prep, this is the score you're going to get, right? So we have to add on to the initial diagnostic.
Another question, is the ACT still doing the essay?
The ACT is still offering the essay. It is optional and no college in the United States requires it. So most people don't do it. I think that that's going to go away fairly quickly too, but they haven't announced anything yet.
Hi, Sheila, I have a question. Thank you by the way, thank you for a very informative session. This was truly wonderful. When you mentioned that some tests are becoming optional, is that the SAT and the ACT at equal rate? Is it completely interchangeable, or is one more optional than another?
It's at an equal rate. Yeah, that's a great question. It is at an equal rate because colleges are changing that policy from the top down and saying, we don't want either test, or you don't have to send us either test. Now, test optional deserves a webinar in itself because there's test blind, there's test optional, and there's test flexible, right? So test blind means no tests. They're not going to look at them even if they have access to them. Test optional means you can send a test. You don't have to send a test, right? And in those cases, I recommend if a student is scoring very well compared to the average score at that college, I recommend that they submit a score, right? But if they're not anywhere near the average, don't submit a score. You can go test optional to those sorts of schools. And then test flexible is a school policy where they will accept other tests in place of the SAT or the ACT. So it used to be that they would accept like 3 SAT subject tests instead of an SAT or an ACT, right? That one won't be there anymore because there's no more SAT subject tests. But many schools will accept IB scores instead, or AP, a certain number of AP scores instead, or even different types of tests.
Got it. And so in that list that you had at the very beginning, I think, where you listed the sort of categories by importance in terms of admissions, the schools that have test optional or are no longer required tests. So is that just, sort of subtracted from that list altogether, or does something else jump ahead into that slot right after the coursework and the grades?
That is an amazing question, actually. Let me share my screen so we can look back at that. That slide. Here, this one, right? So yes. I think for a lot of classes, or excuse me, a lot of schools, if they go test optional, they just kind of X this one out, right? It just won't matter anymore. And the essay will matter more. The extracurriculars will matter more. Just simply subtract it, right? But considering the types of schools that were test optional before the pandemic, they tend to be smaller liberal arts colleges. Right? And smaller liberal arts colleges are very, very interested, not just in academic success, but also in a personality fit, right? So things like the interview or what is said in the teacher recommendations could be more important at those schools, right? And I should also point out that many schools that go test optional do sometimes ask for a graded paper. With the teacher's comments on it, they want to see that. I know Temple University, for example, when it started going test optional, what they did was they also included in their application process a timed essay that you didn't know the prompt of. You had to sit down, I think it was 45 minutes you were given, and they give you the prompt and you have to write it right there. That's your one chance to write the essay. And so they use that as a way to really measure, certain writing and critical thinking skills that they use in the evaluation process. Bard College does a very interesting thing where they used to, at least, I'm not sure if they're still doing this. They would invite students to campus, put them in a sort of seminar, and then evaluate them based on their participation in that seminar. And so colleges have been very creative in trying to figure out what they really want to know about a student, and then adjusting their application process to reflect that, or to give them those measures now that, they're moving away from SAT or ACT scores.
That's fascinating to hear. I've heard about that in European universities now and then, or even very frequently, but never in the US.
Right. Yep. And I think, it's also relevant to just like what's happening to college admissions in COVID. Teacher relationships, I think, are more important than ever. They've always been important, but I think they're more important than ever. And at the same time, they're more challenging than ever because students are just on Zoom. They don't really have that opportunity to casually interact with their teachers. So teachers may not know the students as well, or not have as much time with them. But those teacher recommendations, I think, are very, very important, especially if you think about COVID. A lot of students didn't have grades for the spring of 2020. All of the extracurriculars were canceled from March 2020 on. I know some of them are coming back, but many students who may have had a really great opportunity to have a leadership a leadership role, that was taken from them. Their summer plans, maybe they were going to travel or do an internship or do some sort of research. Those got canceled, right? So a lot of the things that usually matter in admissions were really taken away. But the grades, the teacher recommendations, and the essays, of course, are still a big part of what students are able to do. So those I think have become more important in the last year.
We have another question. Do you have to submit every score, or can you submit the best score?
Yeah, that's another really great question. Now, the true answer is that it depends on the school. But the simple answer is that the vast majority of colleges will look at your best scores. And that could be across different sittings. So let's say you take the ACT twice, and the first time you did really well on English and math, but not so well on reading and science. And the second time you did really well on reading and science, but not so well on the English and math. They're just going to combine the highest scores from all of those sittings. So the highest score for each section, they're going to put them all together as though it was in one sitting. We call that super scoring. And they'll do that with the SAT as well. Some colleges, instead of super scoring, will take your highest single sitting. And then there are some colleges that want to see all of your scores. It's unclear what they do with all of your scores, but they want to see them. So it really depends on the specific school's policy.
All right, well, we will, if there are no other questions, we will probably go ahead and end this. This has been really great. The questions were really great. Thanks for asking, everyone. We are having another webinar in a couple weeks on February 3rd, and that is how do colleges read your application? If that's something you guys are interested in, I will actually find the link right now and put it in the chat.
While you're doing that, Savannah, I'm just going to send my email address around in case anyone has any other questions or you want to get in on a free practice test. Just email me, I'll set you up.